Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ninth episode of our series on the elections in Colombia. We are pleased to have the Stimson Center as co presenter of this episode. And many thanks to Ben Gedan, the director of the Latin American program, for his enthusiastic collaboration. We are truly honored to have the participation of outstanding panelists today, including Laura Ardila, columnist El Espectador, and author of the book La Costa Nostra, an expose on economic and political activities of the Char family from Colombia's Caribbean coast. We also have Valeria Marulanda, strategic communications advisor and a regular presence in the most important media outlets across Colombia. And we also have Miguel Silva, founder of Galileo 6 and a long standing advisor in strategic communications, political management, and crisis management. Welcome, Miguel. And now, today's conversation will be moderated by James Bosworth, Associate Fellow at the Stimson Center and editor of the Latin American Risk Report, an indispensable weekly analysis newsletter for followers of the region. Thank you and welcome, James. And of course, we have Ken Frankel, co moderator and president of the Canadian Council for the Americas. And I can now see that we also have the privilege of having another panelist joining us, Tomás González, former minister and someone who served as a pollster in several presidential campaigns. Thank you very much. Thanks to you, Thomas. And I will now hand over to Ken, our moderator. Ken, Franco, Ken, the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much, Marta. And buckle up, friends from Colombia. We are heading into three very interesting weeks, to say the least. We're in the final stretch of this electoral race and the ninth episodes of our webinar series, which began 11 months ago. When we started, our organizing thread was the approximately 40% of Colombians who, in repeated polls, identified themselves as centrists. We will talk a little bit today about what has been happening to the center, but I will say more in the introduction. We want to open the series with a long conversation with the leading centrist statesman, Humberto de la Calle. And we want to open today's conversation by quoting a tweet from 3 days ago by Humberto de la Calle, in which he listed 10 reasons why, and these are his words, the erosion of democracy during this campaign has been alarming. Number one, he speaks about insults, not debates. Two, preemptive and unsubstantiated attacks on the electoral authority. Three, the specter of fraud with unknown intentions. Four, the terminal collapse of political parties. Five, unprecedented campaign financing, spending controls completely overwhelmed. Six, a use of state power to benefit a candidate the likes of which has not been seen since before the 1950s. Seven, attacks on the press. Eight, state media shamelessly serving one candidacy. Nine, anonymous social media accounts destroying reputations without restraint. And 10, artificial intelligence that has made it impossible to know the truth. What was once evidence is now fiction. And De La Calle concludes that Colombia has moved backwards in its pursuit of democracy. Well, with that encouraging assessment, how did it all unfold, Bose? The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Well, yesterday we received the election results. And we have to say that Abelardo de la Espriella with nearly 44% of the vote. Then we have Ivan Cepeda with 41% and Paloma Valencia with 7%. This is a major shock for Paloma Valencia. At one point, she had polling numbers of 25, nearly 30%. She won more than 3.2 million votes in her primary. On top of that, her vice presidential running mate won 1.2 million votes in the primary. But in yesterday's election, the two of them combined won only 1.6 million. They lost nearly 3 million votes between the primary and yesterday. And what we saw is what we saw is a major polarization of votes towards the extremes of the political spectrum. Between Ivan Cepeda, we know he's a senator, son of a senator from the Union Patriotica, the Patriotic Union, who was assassinated in 1994, a career in human rights in the defense of victims, but an unapologetic ideological figure of the left. And then we have Abelardo de la Espriella, a lawyer who has worked for some very controversial clients. At this point, he comes across as a far right candidate. Not, not really the Uribista right that was Colombians' right wing for the past 20 years. This is a very different right wing, more in the vein of Milei or Bukele than of Uribe, which is a shift for Colombia. Now, these are two very different candidates, not just different in terms of left and right, but also on one side, we have a career politician, 63-year-old career politician who has worked for decades in Congress. And on the other hand, we find ourselves in front of a lawyer who had never been a politician until this election. So yesterday was his first election. Second, an ideologue versus a litigator, a lawyer. An ideologue who has worked for the left his entire life, and on the other side, someone who has no ideology, who had no ideology until last year. Someone who was a populist, who could work for any client willing to pay him. Abelardo is someone who, at this point, appears to be on the right, but that was not the case throughout his whole life. So, on one hand, someone with a decades long ideology, on the other hand, someone whose ideology appeared last year. But there are two similarities, two things that these candidates share. Right now, they are both people who take pride in their radicalism, one from the left, one from the right, and neither wants to be the centrist. Neither wants to capture the center. They want to win their base and nothing more. Second, they are both candidates who want to be the candidate of change. And I say that, uh, Laura, it's obvious that one wants to be the candidate of change because he wants to remove petrism, he wants to win, he wants to move the country to the right. But Ivan Cepeda, on the other hand, is also a candidate of change, not in the sense of wanting to change Colombia's political system or call a constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution. In the sense, it is an election about change. And both candidates believe they will change the system, but they are obviously running on two very different platforms. Those are my opening remarks, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the panelists to see what they think about yesterday's election and also what is going to happen in this second round. Well, thank you very much for that. So, entering this last week, 25% of the voters were indecisive according to the polls, and the big majority was coming of the lowest socioeconomical strata. So, how to vote, right? Miguel, do you want to start? Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, the 40% of Cepeda was with him from the previous weeks. He did not get further support on the last weeks. Who actually did was Abelardo, and that came from a demolition work with Paloma Valencia with a strategic turn that was indeed very interesting in the strategic point of view, which is the didactics that they use. At one point, they decided that they didn't want to fight for the right vote anymore. And I don't agree that much with Boss about the fact that it's a different right. I don't think that it's a different right. It's a more radical right wing, the most radical that has always been with Uribe and that has been rejecting a little bit. They decided to stop fighting for the right wing and they started to fight for the anti establishment vote. So they went from a never to a always and never. So they were able to do a character assassination by Paloma's campaign, this framing of they're the always and we are the never. When in reality, Abelardo has much, if not more, support from the traditional political class as Paloma does. Tomás will speak more about the pooling. He knows far more about pools than I do, but the pools were very misleading. So in reality, we didn't know where Abelardo actually stood. But one can imagine that he made a jump in the last 2 weeks, in the final 2 weeks, between 15 and 20 points, which completely deflated Paloma's campaign. Thank you, Miguel. And look, many people today, analysts, between among others, are commenting on how positive it is for Colombian democracy. The turnout was 57.58%. But then an analysis piece that came out this morning by Hernando Gomez Buendia says, yes, that's so well and good, but Cepeda was counting on a much higher turnout. And that is where he lost, or where we can say at least he lost votes, so to speak. What do you make of that? Well, I think here one could say there are two losers. One, in a certain sense, is Gustavo Petro because they genuinely believe they were going to do much better. And the other clearly is former President Uribe. I think we're looking at a genuinely new political landscape in Colombia, really. And I mean, yes, and here I do differ slightly from Miguel. Abelardo de la Espriella is a new right because it's a 3.0 right wing. Abelardo de la Espriella obtained and sowed what Uribe sowed, which was getting authority back by being a candidate that is much more aligned to these new movements, to these new moments, having a campaign happening on social media. He was able to leverage this digital ecosystem. But I do agree with Miguel about the fact that this has been a campaign anti establishment. And I agree with you as well on the fact that we've gone against the establishment. What has been said 4 years ago about Gustavo Petro is a change that hasn't happened. It continues to happen because it's in Cepeda, but it's a change of this narrative of the establishment that didn't allow the change to happen. And with the voter of Abelardo who wants a change after such a government for the last 4 years. So Cepeda did want new votes, and his votes were very much linked with the Petro's popularity in this sector, but he wasn't able to attract new voters. And that will be one of the big challenges, and the challenges that Abelardo will have as well, because Abelardo obtained completely Paloma's votes. The votes that Paloma still had was of a center that we really don't know where it will transition to, whether it will be towards Abelardo. All right, thank you very much, Vale. Now, Lara, I'm passing the mic to you. I'd like to know what happened in the coast. But before that, Thomas maybe can add something. the influence in the pools. They spoke about that. Do you want to say something about it? So the change or the fall of Paloma at the end of April, what role did the pools have in organizing such a strong demonstrations towards Abelardo? So, hello, and greetings to everyone and to our comrades. I think pools are the best way to measure expectations, right? We have information through the social networks, but I think when you look at polls, thinking about the Congress from the primaries to today's election, the story is more or less the same. Primaries make candidates because Paloma, for example, was a candidate with not such a strong possibility to get to the presidential election. And during the primaries, she got great, great votes, and she was also able to create a ticket with Juan Manuel Oviedo. So she opened a primary with a lot of hope. The thing was about not having to think the same thing to work together. So the dynamics showed a rise which coincided with a fall of Paloma, and that established after a month, more or less, that got established, and also the candidacy of Paloma. Of course, after that, the electorate started to have doubts on multiple reasons whether she was going to be able or not. And I think to the candidates, especially Abelardo, pushed aside the establishment and the possibility for Paloma's candidates to actually turn out somehow. When you look at 2022, people who voted uh, for candidates representing the establishment, and that would last election, some votes to Fajardo and to Gutierrez Pico, those candidates were more institutional, more belonging to the establishment, and they got 29%. So when we look at yesterday's candidates, Paloma with Fajardo, they got 10%. So we cannot call cheat here. The evil is the establishment, the institutions, the always, as we can say, that is still kind of popular. And I think Paloma made many mistakes in conveying the message that she could leader the successful front in the government, and surveys showed that she was losing power by the day. And at the end of the day, of course, the surveys got many things wrong. The polls got many things wrong, but I do think there was clarity over the fact that a lot of people were leaving Paloma to vote something else. So, to summarize, of course, polls are about expectations, and the expectations were that, but we didn't know that it was going to be that strong, right? Thank you, Thomas. I want to pass the mic rather on, but Laura, please do speak about the coast because it is a battlefield, isn't it? Yes, could you please speak about what has happened in the coast? How do you feel like it? So, yes, we always say that the Caribbean is very determining because they have 21% of the whole Colombian population, but making list of winners and losers, as it was said before, when once more I would put in the loser list another part. I think on one certain sense, Gustavo Petro is a leader, but also an excess of trust in these political plans. Once again, they had no determining papers in the elections the presidential elections are usually a much freer vote in the Caribbean, much more emotional ones, syntonized with what is happening in Colombia, unless something extraordinary happens, like in the second round, like it happens in 2014. They won against Manuel Santos in the first round, and a lot of money was injected coming of irregular funds, and these machines activated again, right? So there was a lot of expectations about what was going to happen in Barranquilla because the candidates, as specifically Abelardo de la Espriella, took it as a bit of a headquarters, main headquarters for the main speeches to be given there. It main end of campaign was there as well. And also the Char family, they've been triumphing for the last 20 years, but they usually lose to the left wing in presidential elections. So the answer was similar to 4 years ago. In the eighth department, including San Andres for the historical pact, not with the same levels. There hasn't been an increase in votes of Ivan Cepeda with, for example, the controversial Gustavo Petro. Nevertheless, even if they didn't win in any of the departments of the Caribbean, he did get a huge part of the voting, almost 2 million votes, 1.5 million plus if they've done the numbers right. I think the role of the Caribbean coast is going to be very telling and very interesting going into this second round because now, with both candidates going all in, we'll have to see whether those political machines that typically don't play a decisive role in the first round start to fire up again. 4 years ago, we saw how Petro overcame abstention on the Caribbean coast through transportation. Those alliances he struck with some of the more questioned political clans, those alliances were sealed and materialized through logistics because it is well known that in many regions of the periphery, not just in the Caribbean coast, people simply don't come out to vote unless someone provides them with transportation. That didn't happen in this first round, and we'll see whether this near tie, this margin that isn't entirely clear cut between the two candidates, ends up being decided in part by how they approach these political groups. And it's worth noting that both candidates had been speaking out against career politicians and the establishment, yet both had political groups behind them, some more openly displayed, as in the case of Ivan Cepeda, with, for example, the controversial Carlos Caicedo, and of course, in the case of Abelardo de la Espriella, the Char clan was already there. To name just one from the Caribbean coast, but he also had, for example, the Diaz Mateos, sorry, the Diaz Mateos, or a part of the Santander based Diaz Mateos group with him. So we will see what role these regional political groups play, groups that were not protagonists this time around, but rather ended up on the losing side. All right, thank you, Laura. As she said, we are learning from what happened yesterday with an eye to the second round. I want to hear from the other analysts. What did we learn yesterday about the votes? Which clans, which political movements are going to shift from the first round to the second? We saw yesterday that Uribe and Valencia came out in support of Abelardo's after her defeat, after losing the election. What happens next? What will happen now? Will they put their political machines behind him or will they simply endorse him and step aside? I want to start with Miguel. What did we learn? What strategies will Abelardo and Cepeda use in this second round? And will anything change in the 3 weeks ahead? Well, look, coming from the center and having done a long 2 to 3 years effort with Juanita Uribe and a group of others on how to strengthen the narrative of the political center, I feel completely defeated. The first thing we need to try to understand is how we can rebuild a center that is capable of inspiring the electorate. The center cannot simply be something equidistant from left and right, something elitist, something that doesn't connect with people. The center needs to do some serious soul searching right now and learn from this. Not least because the center does exist. If you look at the six largest cities in Colombia, all of them are governed by centrist mayors, moderate, level headed, people who don't insult anyone, who don't use social media to set the country on fire. And these are very large cities we're speaking about. So the center does exist. I think what comes next is extremely interesting. I thought Abelardo would lose against Cepeda because I thought Cepeda would pull ahead by around 10 points, and I thought that Paloma, on the other hand, could beat Cepeda because the century would rally behind her. But I no longer think that. I now believe Albelardo has a real chance of winning the second round for one reason and one reason only, because Cepeda's strategy is Petro's strategy, and Petro's strategy is designed for Cepeda to lose. Petro's strategy is to cry fraud, because what serves Petro is for Cepeda to lose so that Petro can take to the streets as a kind of Colombian AMLO, right? Which would allow Petro to remain the undisputed owner of the Colombian left. So I'm thinking that Abelardo has a great chance of being president. They have a whole political operation, a very, very well oiled political president. They have, let's say, I mean, the government, of course, also has public contracting money behind it and a good portion of criminal organizations' money behind it as well. Some of what remains of the small cash flow from Chavismo will play a role too. But as Laura said, in the second round, an enormous amount of money is going to be spent. Much of it ill-gotten in many cases, and they're going to play very hard. But I'm getting this sense that Cepeda's default strategy is Petro's strategy. And this Petro strategy of a crying fraud from the very start doesn't bring that many votes. It is not a winning strategy. It is a losing strategy. So what we saw last night is really striking to me. Thank you. And Valeria, what do you make of that? The fact that yesterday we saw Petro and Cepeda claim that there was fraud. And it is, I mean, as Miguel said, and I agree, it is a loser strategy, not a winner strategy for sure. So what do they do? And can they change the narrative in the 3 weeks ahead? Well, I think what they came out and said is consistent with the strategy this government has followed over the past 4 years. I mean, ultimately, Petro is part of the institutional order, but throughout these 4 years, he has been working against the very institutional order. So he has essentially denounced his own government. So this is, I mean, in a way, it is a natural consequence of what these 4 years of President Petro have been about: sowing chaos, casting doubt on institutions. So I think that's what it is. Now, I do agree with Miguel that coming out and saying this is a problem for the minority who currently see themselves as a centrist voters, because it does raise the question, how am I supposed to vote for a candidate who isn't even acknowledging the results of an election? So I mean, in that sense, because I mean the center, and part of what the center tried to say throughout this campaign was, we respect the constitution, we respect the institutions, we want to protect the institutional framework. And now you have a candidate telling you he's not going to respect that framework, which might have been the one thing that could have appealed to some centrist voters, the argument that, I mean, you get the center away as well. You know, he's also pushing the center away from that value which matters to them. Well, thank you very much, Tomas. I want to ask you about the center and centrist voters. And I want to know first, Paloma's votes. So, are the votes of Paloma from the right and of Fajardo or the other centrist candidates, are those votes transferable? Can their leaders tell voters to support Abelardo de la Espriella or Ivan Cepeda and have them follow what is going to happen to Paloma's voters, what is going to happen to the centrist voters right now, and which candidate do they seem likely to support in the second round. Well, I think, James, that in modern democracies, voters generally make up their own minds, right? Of course, it matters what signal their leader or preferred candidate gives. But if that signal is in some way inconsistent with values they hold deeply, people will make their own decision. I think this has always been somewhat true, but today that is much more pronounced. And I run the following numbers in my head, all right? So I look at yesterday's elections results and I say, okay, turnout was high, quite high. 4 years ago, we had 55% turnout in the first round. This year, we had 58%. So if you run the following exercise and say, well, if we have the same 58 that voted in the second round last year, and last year, that is, I mean, in 2022, meaning that today's first round turnout matched last cycle's second round turnout, and it grew by 3 points. If that holds, we'll need roughly 12 million votes to clear the threshold. Whoever gets close to 12 million votes should be able to become president. If you subtract the blank ballots, assuming that those who voted blank this time will vote blank again next time, and not certain that changes dramatically, maybe it grows slightly, we're already below 12 million, somewhere around, I don't know, 11.5, 11.6 million, maybe a little more. If turnout grows, as it did last time, by 3 percentage points, we'll be at roughly 12.5 million votes. And subtracting the blank again will be around 12 million. So if the winning threshold is somewhere between 11.5 and 12 million votes, and Abelardo starts with roughly 10.3, 10.4 million votes, well, he needs somewhere around, let's say, between 1.5 and 2 million additional votes. Ivan Cepeda needs something like 2 to 2.5 million more, significantly more than what Abelardo needs. So if we look at where they can get these votes from, where they can get these votes. So we have 1.6 million votes, those who voted to Paloma Valencia or Oviedo. If he gets all of those votes, he's already winning. We have 1 million votes of Fajardo, and I think Fajardo's case is much more problematic in this case. What has been said yesterday, you guys said it, Miguel, etc., it doesn't help because a left that doesn't recognize or acknowledges election results is very problematic for the central voters. And then we have Lopez votes, 50,000 votes. He already said that Abelardo would be never, and Cepeda maybe could get there. And then we have the other right wing candidate, Votero, which has roughly the same amount of, of votes. So that will go towards the same direction that Paloma's votes will go to. So this whole list, very long one, saying that there's a very clear path paved the way for Abelardo's presidential election. Polls showed us that Paloma's votes were going to Abelardo's. Paloma herself said, I will be supporting Abelardo in the future. And I think people, after going into grief, I think Paloma's voters will get to Abelardo eventually. So I think there has been a clear path paved from the institutional point of view as well, unless there's some violence situation. And I'm actually pretty worried about the level of speech that we heard yesterday night. Yes, I would like to add something to what Tomás said. Yeah, so this idea, I do think that Abelardo has all the cards on the table to win. I think he wins with the strategy that his company had, with the kind of candidate Ivan Cepeda was. for the really not attractive campaign that he did in terms of attracting people besides the left wing. But at a certain point, I think we're going back to the topic of the center. I feel like, once again, there's a possibility there of something happening. Sergio Fajardo yesterday said that he was going to look at Wales, and we know that those are not endorsing votes. It's not that Claudia will go out and say people vote this and they will actually vote this, but there could be gestures, right, that might convey calmness in people, in the electorate, about who can be feared less by the center. So a part of the center vote for Petro. So we understand that Cepeda is less frightening for the center than Abelardo. And for sure, some kind of gesture around the new promise of respecting the institutions, of respecting the results, etc. But I think there we have a very important political moment that will be happening at some point whenever Fajardo can speak again, which could give some kind of oxygen to Cepeda's campaign. And Cepeda is not helping himself. He, well, besides what he said yesterday, not acknowledging the results without bringing any evidence, and now he's criticizing people who put on the Colombian Football Federation T-shirt, and now he's asking to the football team to tell people not to use the T-shirt. I mean, whatever logic person of the center will be absolutely outraged with this new speech that he had. But I do think that something around that might be happening because there is a serious worry by a lot of people on the Abelardo's possible triumph. We know that he's for sure an authoritarian, anti-democratic, anti-human rights, homophobic, machist. He's very friends with questionable people like Bukele. So I think the center is asked to act, and the leaders of the center said they will move to the second round, and it will be interesting to understand that might something might be happening. And I think there's something else that will be happening, and I hope it's sooner than later. Maybe it's already too late, thinking of what they said yesterday, and that has to do with the Colombian journalism, with this self-criticism that we'll have to sit down and have a talk about. I remember the whole reflections on American journalists when Trump won, on how they weren't able to read the electorate, to read the room of the voters. We weren't able with certainty to assess who is the Abelardo's voter. Of course, there's emotions, feelings, the National Day, this populist message, the alternative of being the other options to Petro. But what is moving these people? And as a journalist myself, I love the exercise of asking myself these questions. I was having a chat with my mom yesterday, and these are small informations, but I think they're very important. She told me that the avocado seller in Cartagena selling on the street was going to vote to Abelardo. And I was like, Mom, but how is that possible? Why? And tell me why. So she told me that at the market where I go, everything is everyone is blackmailed. We cannot even work. It's a very bad framework. And that is the security speech that Abelardo sold, this deterioration of security. Apparently, Abelardo convinced everyone that he could work on that. But, we cannot just think that Abelardo's voters are lacking awareness and voting for this questionable person. I think we'll need to get in and start thinking about how to change this narrative, not to trust the future of the country to be in the hands of this kind of people, this kind of characters that have been appearing all over the world in this democratic fall. Yes, of course. What your mom told you from Cartagena has been repeated every day in Medellin. Same thing, once and again. So we thought we knew where the Abelardo's voters were coming from different socioeconomic strata and all of that, but we learned something. And what we learned is that that is not the case. We might want to speak a bit about the possible presidency of both candidates, but before that, I'd love to speak a bit about personalities, all right? It's part of the post-mortem election round. So we could speak that the Uribe's trajectory of being the pater familia, the family father, into the favorite uncle to the grandfather who has to spend more time in his farm with the nephews and nieces. That is the impression I have from here, from Medellin, which is the base. So we could say, and I don't want to say that he has no power, he does have influence in many different places, but we could be saying that in the Uribe's time, I think he's starting to fall. Do you agree on that or not? Tomás, Miguel, Vale, whoever wants to take the mic. Yes, there are people who say, I mean, Alvaro Uribe and Abelardo are very much friends. Apparently, according to Abelardo's network, we have scenes of Abelardo giving black glasses to Uribe, Uribe getting to, driving together with Uribe. So many different scenes. They are very much friends. And apparently, Abelardo, people say, has been a prototype of the extreme right to put there so that the center could find itself more in the center itself much before the primary sessions. So Uribe apparently, some people say, might be one of the people's close to Abelardo's campaign, but he was defeated because there was a very violent war, and Uribe, was the minority. The Uribism, where Uribe is on top, has 6%, 7% of the votes. And he also led a campaign. He was very much a protagonist in Paloma's campaign, and Paloma made him a protagonist, which I think was a mistake. I mean, can you know, in Colombia, ex presidents don't die unless they actually die. They always have political influence, and they never actually die. They never die. Yes, even if they spend all of their remaining lifetime in their little farms. Laura, do you have Valeria, anything to share about that? Yes, I think just like Miguel said, politicians never die. They just never die. They're almost eternal and infinite. But I do think that that has been a defeat for Uribe. And the voter that we see in Abelardo, I mean, we acknowledge in Uribe the support that Uribe gave and what he did in the past. But the voter of Abelardo is also telling Uribe, all right, I mean, go play with your nephews in your farm, right? So we have this average voter that has always spent his time close to Uribe, but is now letting Uribe aside, which is the same people that condemned Uribe for backing Juan Manuel Santos as his candidate. And from that point on, an important part of Uribe's base begins to erode. The Uribistas, who feel that they backed Juan Manuel Santos and Santos betrayed them, who then backed Ivan Duque and felt that Duque also betrayed them in a certain way, and who felt that Paloma was going to be more of the same all over again. So there is indeed a strong Uribismus current that feels Uribe is now an elderly figure making poor decisions. Yes, thank you. Thomas, yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, I just wanted to add something slightly complementary to what Miguel and Valeria have been saying. Their comments have focused on Uribe as a figure who rallies the right, Uribe as a figure capable of mobilizing the right. But I think Uribe is extremely important as a figure for mobilizing the left. Because Uribe is someone who is intensely, deeply despised by the left, particularly by its hardline elements. If you look at Cepeda's candidacy, where did it come from? Because I mean, Cepeda, he was a no one, electorally speaking. He was a minor figure last year. What gave Cepeda a slight edge over the others and allowed him to consolidate the historical pact, the Colombian party, which is itself a very political diverse coalition, was the legal case against Uribe. He was the one who managed, or at least that's how it was sold, the one who secured a ruling against Uribe and the eventual conviction and imprisonment of Uribe in their legal dispute. And that was strong enough to give him the lead and consolidate his candidacy. And then, of course, while the rest followed, people came to respect that. Other candidates stepped aside. So I wouldn't underestimate the value for the left of playing the Uribe card at decisive moments. And I think it works on both sides for his ability to rally the right and for his ability to mobilize the left. Laura, do you want to come in? I want to spend a few minutes on Juan Daniel Oviedo. Do you want to cover that when we get to Uribe or not? You're a mute. Sorry, you're a mute. Sorry, yes. Just to say briefly that I think Uribe did lose, all right? He was defeated, but it's somewhat more complex than that, honestly. I mean, he lost, but at the same time, he remained and continues to be central to this election, as Tomás says, for both the left and the right. The only figure mentioned yesterday in the victory speeches of both candidates going through the second round, someone who was neither the sitting president nor a candidate themselves, was Álvaro Uribe. Cepeda devoted several minutes to him, in fact, and I think Uribe will play a role because it must be said, even if it's obvious, that the values he represents are very much present in the voters who support Abelardo de la Espriella. They are not a different set of values. In fact, I would ask myself whether they didn't support Paloma partly because this alternative existed or whether there was some element of machismo in the reluctance to entrust national security, which is what tends to matter most to the electorate, to a woman. But yes, the ideological core is there. Uribe, part of the reason why Abelardo de la Espriella is supported is precisely because he also represents what Uribe thinks and says. And I think his role will certainly be there accompanying de la Espriella if he goes on to win. I also think it will be interesting to see what kind of judicial protection he ends up finding in that new government, which will also matter enormously to him personally in legal terms, right? That specific protection. Yes, thank you, Laura. I just want to briefly touch on the subject of Juan Daniel Oviedo, not at length, because it will be part of another webinar that we are planning, but in terms of combining the discussion about the center and where the centrist votes migrate to, you also Paloma's speech last night, right? She said immediately, I am going to support Abelardo. We must fight against communism. Those were her words, etc., etc., right? And immediately Juan Daniel Viero's comments went in a completely, well, not completely opposite direction, but he was clearly very distressed. He characterized De La Esprilla's campaign and persona as a dirty, homophobic, misogynistic, and so on. He was very angry. And he also said he wanted to be the leader of the center. Now, as we were told at the outset, he won 1.2 million votes. The question is, are we witnessing the birth of a new centrist leader? And the other question is, well, will those votes that he won in the first round, will those votes migrate easily to Abelardo's in the second round? Who wants to start on any of these two questions? I think we have to acknowledge Oviedo's genius, right? In a sense that, I mean, being the top vote getter from the center, Paloma outperformed him, of course, but he obtained the highest vote share among centrist candidates. He's an agile, dynamic, sharp candidate. But I don't think he owns those votes. And in fact, he doesn't own votes he couldn't even deliver yesterday. And I also think it was a mistake At the time, it seemed like a smart move to me, but I have to acknowledge that today, I think it was an error to have chosen him because it meant asking voters who already faced the test of voting for the first female president to now vote for a ticket with a woman and a gay man. And I think that was too much for the Colombian electorate, unfortunately, because I personally thought it was a strong ticket. I think they made another mistake, which I would describe using a cocktail analogy like a dry martini problem. The running mate is the vermouth of the dry martini. No vermouth and it's just gin. It doesn't taste right. Too much vermouth, there's no dry martini. It's a disaster. I think they put Oviedo too front and center in the campaign and that did damage. Now, Oviedo will be a very important centrist leader going forward. He has the age for it. Others are stepping back. Fajardo no longer has a political career ahead of him. So there is space for him to play a role. But remember, the center, which does exist, the center exists, but it gets destroyed in presidential campaign. But it exists, and it exists in such a way that many mayors are centrist. But the center is very fragmented with parties, movements, and coalitions. So he will be a centrist player, but so will David Luna, and so will the current mayors when they leave office. Carlos Fernandez Galan is a hugely important centrist leader, and the same will be true of some of the others. Yes, yes. Can I continue with that question about the center? Well, in in the next presidential term, we're going to see there are many centrists in Congress, and neither of the two candidates has a majority there. If Cepeda wins, he has a plurality of congressional seats, but not a working majority to work with. And de la Espriella has 5 members of Congress. He won't get far. He cannot pass legislation with only the right behind him. He needs the center in Congress. So a question we've received is, what is Uribe's role and will he have influence in Congress? But I want to ask about Oviedo and other centrist leaders. Who is the centrist figure who will lead in Congress? And is it possible to moderate de las Priellas or Cepeda's agenda if either becomes president? Well, if you like, I'll jump in on that one. Well, look, I think Abelardo would find it easier to manage Congress than Cepeda would find it easy. I mean, at the end of the day, neither of them has a majority, but clearly, even though Salvación Nacional ended up with very few seats, the Democratic Center will vote with Abelardo. So they already have that bloc consolidated. Then you have the Pacto Histórico, the historical pact, and then we have the Green Alliance, the Alianza Verde, which will likely align with it. So you roughly have two counterbalancing blocks. And then you have, as always, these pivot parties, which turn out to be Colombia's traditional parties, parties that end up, I don't know, end up being parties that are very transactional at the end of the day. And I think Abelardo has a greater capacity to run a transactional political operation in Congress rather than what Cepeda could do. Because Cepeda, by nature, given the personality he has and how ideological and disciplined he is, I'm not sure he would accept putting a political operator in place the way Petro did. And even with that, Petro still found things very difficult on many fronts. But I don't just see Cepeda thinking about putting a political operator in place right now. So, in practical terms, I think Abelardo would be much more capable of managing Congress than what Cepeda would. Thank you. And Laura? Yes, I would add to what Valeria is saying that in any case, Abelardo would still face. I mean, I agree that Abelardo would be the one with more of that ability. He would be the one with the most ability in doing that, but he would still face enormous challenges in Congress. So, without going into detail, let me just say, I mean, the fact that he's insulting some groups like he did in Cesar with Pecuello, with uh, part, the MP who ended up helping Petrism because he was the one who saw the name of one of the ministries of the Ministry of Sport. So I mean, he ended up being alive with petrism because of bureaucracy and because of this set of transactions, indeed. So to highlight what a good player he would be, but also he's been insulted by Abelardo de la Espriella. Abelardo wasn't so precautious to keep silence that he could have kept to be able to better negotiate with them in Congress. So I think we'll have a situation there with the strength of democracy and the different contracts that will be negotiated. There is no evidence that this transactional dynamics will change in Congress. So with that strength, maybe they'll be able to fix the hurt hearts, right? But about the political class and Congress, I think it will be nice to know what kind of role the Char family would end up playing, which are not just an extra group supporting, but rather the group that have been supporting Abelardo in the main way. There's a lot of information. Some information has not been confirmed, but it is all about what they did in the back end, in the back office, to make sure that the Caribbean would vote for Abelardo. That would be uh, reaching their dream of having a presidential candidate on their side, on their payroll. So it would be very interesting to know what kind of role they would be playing on that. And then after the Congress, I mean, besides the Congress not being there with their own family name, but still having allies, right? So we'll see what kind of strength this government can give to that. Yes, one question. Thank you very much, Laura, for that. I think this is the very first election. I could be very wrong. The first election where people speak about bets and the market of betting. And apparently, there was a lot of comments about how this affects the um, the whole election process. So, what do you think about the bets and the popular polls? Well, I'd say two things or three things here. I think they had some bets did some I mean had some great success in some specific things, but also individual bettors can move the needle, right? Because it's a small market. It is an hypothesis that this might be happening because there has been some strong movements, and it is also worth questioning whether bets, right, or betting can actually have an influence and how much we should invest or campaign should invest on that. There's someone who tweets in English about the Colombian election with a small dog as an emoji. We don't know who that is, and that has been greatly associated with one of the political parties of the spectrum, saying and encouraging people to bet on the results of the presidential election. So I think there is something there, but I don't think Colombia is actually a case for that being real. And for sure, not just the Colombian average voter is putting much attention to it. I think it's something more about people who are obsessed by politics and obsessed about being right on the social networks. But I don't think it's such a huge phenomenon in Colombia. And if I can say something about Juan Daniel, something very short that I want to say, the following thing. In Latin America, what we see, I think in the rest of the world as well, we're choosing people who are very contrary to establishment. And in that specific ideology, we should pick the ones that are authentic, that don't want to have to answer to previous governments. These people are very open speaking with much frankness, people who have no problem saying what they think, like Milei, like Bukele, like even Petro. And the only person that in the center I feel like has those characteristics is Juan Daniel Oviedo. I don't think that anyone else of that list, David Luna, like Miguel said, or anyone else of the rest of this list of the center, I think they're too much, too linked to the establishment to be able to be digested by today's electorate. I think that that would be something that, I mean, he would generally be offering something different, but he put himself through a very difficult test. He said that on the 3rd of June, he will do what he'll do. He didn't have to get out and say that he's an homophobic and misogynistic and whatever else. Even if he thinks about it and he thinks like that, these are the moments in which he's not playing in those elections anymore. Paloma is not playing with those elections anymore. So we need to spend much attention in making sure that they don't make the same mistakes that the other one who said they were going to look at whales, that will hunt him until his grave. So let's hope that he won't excavate his own grave with such a bad comment, because I think Juan Daniel Oviedo could be one of the main leaders for the center. Yes, so we're going to move to the final questions. I want to ask the different panelists about the center itself. In the whole Latin America, we saw presidential elections happening and being debated by left and right. Chile a while ago, Peru now, Brazil, and the presidential election in Colombia. The extreme left against the extreme right. There's a pulverization of the rest. What I want to know is, after Cepeda's or Abelardo's election, what are we going to see? Will we see more things happening in Colombia? Is there a rush to be able to get to pools? And we can start with Lara and then we can go passing the mic to everyone else. Yes, I think we're going to see an even stronger polarization with an additional risk, which is the element of violence. In this election specifically, we have very painful souvenirs with the Rivers assassination. And I think we're seeing these polarizations happening already with the attitude of both candidates. They'll be speaking about a debate, but yesterday they were just insulting each other, calling each other criminals and bandits. So, what kind of messages are they conveying? What kind of messages are they giving to their followers? So on the 21st of June, whoever wins, the other one will be the leader of the opposition, or at least in case of Cepeda, if Cepeda loses, it could be Cepeda's, but there will also be Petro there. And they will be using the same mechanism of social networks and social media and information and emotions, and the fear managed by algorithms. So there's nothing that makes us think that that will not be the panorama, the landscape in Colombia in the next few months. A leader with enough strength, electoral speaking and politically speaking, to guide a specific sort of moderation. We've seen this happening after the big the big painful attacks of this campaign. We feel that that will be happening even more. Yes, I do agree that we're moving towards radical polarization, which much violence possible. In the center, I'd have much to say. One thing is to kill the center because of polemical polarization. The other thing is for the center to commit suicide. I mean, the center could have consolidated a candidate in October and not to have many small candidates in January. We spoke about that in 2021, we spoke about that in 2025, and we still cannot succeed in avoiding that because there has a lot of problems. I mean, there's a lot of problems about gathering the candidates. We have candidates for with signatures, candidates with parties, but the center needs to learn from Uribe. They chose their candidate in October. There were some problems with Uribe and all, but they chose uh, a candidate in October through Hunger Games. They had five candidates, they killed four, and the one still standing is the candidate. We need to learn from that mechanics. And there's also a whole thing about narratives. Once again, the center cannot do this very elitist thing of being not in the left, not in the right, etc., etc. The center needs to be able to animate and to invite the electorate to a party, all right, not to a reflection about what doesn't work. So I think there could be a space after 4 years of horror. We could find a space for the center. The center can reunify the country. Colombia has been suffering, so I think my hope is keeping the optimism high because right now optimism is extremely low. Yes, I really agree with that. We are moving towards a strong polarization. It's also important to say that Colombia already has a very consolidated left wing, and that is something that 4 years ago happened, and we had never seen that happening in Colombia before. Now, if De La Espriella becomes president, his style is polarizing. And I don't know whether he will moderate once in government, whether he would, I don't know, bring in a technocrat here or there to inject some I don't know, some calm into things, or whether he would also effectively exile Juan Manuel Restrepo because he has already said that Juan Manuel will handle international affairs and he will handle domestic matters. So you start to wonder, right? How is he actually going to put that team together? So it is also going to depend a great deal on how that government develops, whether it ends up being his or Cepeda's, to see whether there is any opportunity for the center to be reborn. And yes, the truth is that the center, in terms of capturing voters in elections, is complex because, as Miguel says, it does not generate emotion. Polarization generates far more emotion, triggering fear and rage is far more effective than appealing to reason. And the center always stays too much in the realm of reason. So that is a huge challenge the center would face in 4 years' time. But I think we're still far too early right now to be able to think about that. I think far greater challenges await us in the short and medium term. Thank you. Thomas, please. Yes, and I wanted to make two very specific points. The first is this saying, I heard it in Colombia, but it may be more universal, that you campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And I think there is an important unknown element here, as Valeria was raising, in terms of what happens once one of the two is elected, because I think for the general public, they are fundamentally unknowns. We know very little about them, aside from the two or three things that are very much a product of staging and communication strategy. We know very little about how either of those two figures would actually behave in government. So that is the first point. I think that once they win, they will face the immediate need to think about a 4 year agenda to sustain the capacity to govern over 4 years, which is extremely difficult. So they will have to think about how pragmatic or non pragmatic they are prepared to be, how bold they're willing to be, because this line is different. The other point that I wanted to give, I think it's a critical point about the moment of getting to know these candidates from when they're elected to when they start working. They can have very good or very bad moments for public opinion. I think Ivan did a very bad thing. In that period, well, people were like, okay, he's the president, let's see what I think about him, and start building on this image. So he took the guitar out, he met with the football fans, so he had a whole series of things that what happened was strengthening the worries that people had about him. On the other side, we had Claudia Lopez with a reputation of being very intransigent, very aggressive. But when she won, the next day she went to Manuel Galan, and she went to his house and she helped and supported him. So she showed herself as being a candidate for everyone. The relationship with the public opinion, with the president, was very complicated. The reputation with Claudia supported itself for a long time. So I think they will give us a lot of hints on how they'll be able to govern. And that will be the beginning. The fact is that what kind of results we'll actually be getting. Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you to everyone, of course. Thank you to Valeria, Laura, Miguel, James, and Ken, of course, for such a great conversation. Thank you very much for the Stimson Center for such a great collaboration on this webinar. To all of you who joined this meeting, thank you very much. We invite you to follow our social network accounts to receive information about the next episodes, or at least the last episode on the second round of Colombian elections, presidential elections, and you will also be able to receive different notifications on the future events. You'll have these videos available translated in English, French, and Spanish. See you next time. Thank you and bye.